If I can get this to pop up the way I want.
Absolutely. We see your slides. They're not in presentation mode, but we can hear you.
There we go. Okay, slideshow from the beginning.
Yep.
I'd like to thank you, Ken, for your good words. And Colleen, I'd like to thank you for your excellent organization of this effort. It's commendable. Very much appreciate your skill sets. We're going to be talking, as Colleen said, about the men's foods today, the big game in particular, but we're also going to be focusing on all of the different issues associated with their habitat, which is, of course, necessary to support the populations of harvestable surpluses that we have of these different species. The Wildlife Program's mission, just very briefly, is to provide sustainable harvest opportunities for the big game species of the first food order. And we do that by protecting, conserving, and restoring their habitats and the populations. And secondly, we also focus on the native game bird populations on the reservation. But our primary focus and most of what we do is the big game. Now, there's a number of implications of climate change to big game species of the first food order. And we're going to hear about most of these today in some detail. I'm just going to summarize them here for you now. Starting with disease, and we know that the changes in the climate can increase disease vectors and severity in big game populations. Secondly, and very similarly, parasites can increase significantly. Those two different elements in themselves can weaken a population or an individual and make them more susceptible to predation. From a landscape perspective, we know that the global climate change in our region here has increased the frequency of massive wildfires, which can have immediate mortality impacts to wildlife species, but it can also have significant long-term changes to their habitats, some for the good, some not so much. And then our own response to climate change with human peoples moving from different parts of the country, running from drought or undesirable climate. We can increase the conversion and fragmentation of important habitats. And it's critical that we maintain, through our conservation efforts, migratory pathways for big game and other wildlife species so that they can move successfully in response to climate change. From a plant community standpoint, there are a number of different changes that we're going to be seeing today. One of them, and probably the most pronounced, is the change in phenology or timing of the different life history stages of the individual plants within the plant community. And secondly, changes in composition of the plant community. And that includes changes in the frequency of native species, but it also includes increases in invasive non-native species. And Cheryl is going to be speaking to that issue specifically a little later on. And then along with that change in plant communities, we can see a decrease in nutrition available for big game species, and that can have a significant impact on the productivity of those species, and Dr. Peckham is going to speak to that issue. And then collectively, what we see is a change in the range of the suitable habitats, both from an elevational standpoint, a latitudinal, and a spatial extent, as habitats move upslope and to the northern climes to escape dry, hot increases in temperatures. That all equals stress for the big game populations that the tribes rely on for their culture and traditions. I'm going to run really quickly through the 8 species of big game that the tribes put on the longhouse table. The archetype of the first foods is the mule deer, Yamas, and it's a species that's found throughout the tribe's territories. Rocky Mountain Elk, another very important species. Right now we have hundreds of these animals coming down from the foothills onto the agricultural lands of the reservation in their natural annual migration. The white-tailed deer, a population of introduced to the reservation. It took off to very large numbers, but has been significantly impacted recently by diseases, including blue tongue and that's wiped the population out. We have a small fraction of the numbers that we used to have. To noon, the bighorn sheep, a population that also has been devastated by disease, but disease that's transmitted from domestics, not so much an issue of climate change. But these are a species that relies on very specific habitats and high elevations, and those could be threatened with changes in climate. Same thing goes for the wawúkya, the Rocky Mountain goat species that we're seeing increasing in our area. We had one of these on the reservation just a few weeks ago, migrating around looking for breeding opportunities. And the moose, it's a species that has never in recent history had a viable population in this region, in this area of the reservation, but is now moving down from the north. This species, the range of the species may be limited by parasites. They have a parasite called the carotid worm that is they get from mule deer. And that worm lives in the carotid artery of the mule deer. But when it lives in the carotid artery of the moose, it can actually turn around in the artery and plug the flow of blood, and that can be lethal for the moose. So we may see that disease and parasites limit the populations of moose as they try to establish in this region. And then wawataw, the pronghorn antelope, the fastest land mammal in North America. And of course, kokal, the bison. This is a species that the tribe has used for thousands of years and has migrated in and out of the tribe's territories. Program focuses the way that we deal with these issues is through technical services to the tribal government and the public, not unlike this presentation today. We work closely with habitat conservation and restoration efforts throughout the region. We review and comment on land and resource management actions by our state and federal partners that might impact the resilience of habitats and the opportunity for our big game species to move between different habitats. And we work as wildlife co-managers with the state and federal wildlife managers doing management and research work. And Scott's going to share some of the work that he's been doing with the state. The territories that we're talking about working within include this shaded area. It's the traditional use of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes. The darker areas depict areas where we have more references to tribal history and tradition. The lighter areas less, but you can see this vast expanse that the tribes utilize to meet their daily round or yearly rounds in pursuing first foods. And it's important that we manage, as I said before, pathways for migration throughout this area and outside of this area if we're going to be successful. Now, the tribes had that large of an area largely because they were horse-mounted people, and as a horse-mounted tribe, they used to travel as far as the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to hunt bison. We need to maintain our ability to continue to move towards the first foods, but we also need to maintain the ability of the first foods to move within their potential habitats as climate change impacts us. 10 years ago, we opened the bison harvest again in Yellowstone, and since that time, we have seen the hunt date beginning shift backwards almost a month and a half. We used to start in January and February. Now we're hunting primarily in March. And this may be due largely in part to changes in the climate from global warming. All these issues are going to be important for us to deal with. It's complex, but the real purpose of this is to maintain access to the first foods for the longhouse table. And that's a simple and central focus of our efforts. And now I'm going to turn the screen over to Dr. Peckham, and he will teach you a little bit about the research work that he's been doing for the tribes.
Okay, thanks, Carl.
It's the same button to unshare as to share. It should have a triangle, a rectangle with an X now in it, is to unshare, Carl.
I unshared.
Perfect. You got your slide, Scott?
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for joining on today. As Carl mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit briefly about potential effects of the changing climate on elk, and I'll link that to other big game species and primarily the Blue Mountain region. I'll kind of go over relationship between our big game populations and their biophysical environment. I'm going to weave in some of the highlights from research that we've been working on in-house through a grant from the U.S. Forest Service in collaboration with Forest Service and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then we'll look at some plausible climate scenarios in our region and assess sort of or postulate the possible impacts on elk and other big game. So what I'm gonna do here is sort of we have a really nice assemblage of big game species in our local region. We have 3 deer species, mule deer, white-tailed deer, and elk that I'm going to call habitat generalists. All these animals have established populations in basically from the driest deserts of the Southwest all the way into Canada. They've evolved locally and adapted to those habitats over many, many thousands of years, and so they're highly adaptable in that way. And then we have species that have much more specific habitat requirements, like mountain goats and bighorn sheep, that rely on the high alpine, rocky, rough terrain. A lot of specific features that are not, while they're widely distributed, is not found in wide geographic range in large quantity. And then for us locally, pronghorn and moose also have fairly limited available habitat. They also require more specific food sources than, say, elk and deer. And so I'm going to talk, a lot of this talk is going to focus on sort of the regulation of animal populations in general and how predominantly habitat affects that. But in general, any animal population is sort of regulated by what I'm going to call top-down forcing, abiotic forcing, and bottom-up forcing. Examples of sort of the top-down effects would be your predation, hunting, and disease. Abiotic would be examples of that are extended droughts, extreme winters that put a lot of stress and cause additional or widespread mortality events. And then, of course, the bottom up is the habitat. And that's sort of going to be the central focus and what we really kind of emphasize, I'm going to emphasize on today, because we know a lot about climate effects on habitat directly versus sort of the indirect effects of all these other ones. So as climate change, we know it's occurring. There's no question about that. We've measured that over the last several decades. So we're already, able to determine some impacts. So that there's a lot of questions surrounding, of course, and how it's going to affect each of these factors that regulate wildlife populations and sort of the interrelationship between all of these. But I'm gonna put it through the lens of habitat and primarily focused on elk because we have a lot of information about them, and they provide a really good example for our talk today. So animal populations are really set. The stage is set for them by the available habitat. And when I say habitat, that's really shaped by the local climate, the underlying soil, the overlying topography, the past disturbance history and current disturbance history, and the community of plants that's established at that site. So, and all of that combines to provide a available plant community that wildlife can harvest for diet as a part of their diet and subsequently derive the nutrition that they require in order to carry out their entire life history. And that's all linked to how well the population does as a whole. When you sum all the animals up over that landscape and look at the survival and births and deaths and all that, you end up with whether the population is growing or shrinking, or how large it is, how many individuals. All of that is really highly correlated to the quality and quantity of available habitat. And one way we look at animal condition and understand wildlife population performance is in their body condition. If you think about it, the expression of how the quality of habitat is often found in the amount of fat that animals accumulate during the growing season. And we've really, through several decades of research, have found that the body condition of reproductive age females is really a factor that is regulating elk population and other big game species, not just elk. And generally, the reduction in body fat during late summer has explained low pregnancy rates, reduced survival of young, and reduced survival of adults the following year. So the inability to extract high quality protein and nutrients and build a large amount of body fat prior to winter is incredibly explanatory in population. So here we look at the distribution of our Rocky Mountain elk in our region. They're widely distributed, as I mentioned, probably more so than almost any other species here, except for maybe mule deer. The summer range is roughly mapped in yellow, the winter range in blue, and the green is where those two ranges overlap. So we have a fair understanding of where these animals occur annually and on a kind of a coarse scale. So there's plenty of information on elk regionally and across their range, but we also have been collecting some information locally so that we can begin to understand how, we can look back at this later and understand how climate might be influencing or elk's use of the landscape and potential impacts on their population. So through acquiring data from GPS collared elk, where they are wearing a radio collar that basically connects to a satellite and uploads its location several times a day, we can begin to understand some of these things. For example, the map in the upper right here is derived from GPS data from several female elk here locally. I'll just throw a pointer up here. So this is the reservation boundary in sort of charcoal gray color. The light blue area is a winter range polygon from that group of elk, and the reddish colored is their summer range. So we kind of have an understanding of how they distribute on the landscape annually and how much of the land area they're using every winter and what that range of elevations represents. We also have kind of built a model that predicts the relative probability of use by elk on the winter range around the reservation. So we've sort of modeled that's based on various physical attributes of the landscape. So we kind of have that snapshot in time of what was at this moment in time in the mid 2015s, what was determining where elk were distributed during winter. What were the key factors they were looking for? So we kind of have that snapshot in time. And we've also been investigating some of their migratory movements, what time they begin their migration in the fall, when they started again in the spring, how long, in distance and duration. So we have some sort of background data there. And we've also been looking at any barriers to habitat connectivity or their migration patterns. So it's important to understand that as we continue to collect data in coming decades and trying to understand how the climate may be influencing that. And of course, we can make hypotheses right now. So in general, Blue Mountain climates are, or our current climate over the Blue Mountains. We have, generally cold winter with frequent snow, although, January was pretty warm, but I tend to not forget that we do have real winter here. The spring is fairly wet with frequent rain. The summer and the fall is typically very, very dry with almost no rain. And the snowpack in winter really provides the slow delivery of water to this region that supports all the plant growth. So if we look at that graphically, here's the winter snowpack is in yellow, and that tapers off in the spring. The rains pick up a little bit, and then we have that soil moisture that strings out well into summer to deliver water to grow all the the food sources for elk. That's this sort of darker red curve here. We call that the phenology curve. So the plants, their growth increases in spring, peaks at some point, and then the plants begin to senesce and die as we go towards fall. And on the lowest panel here, the brown line is basically the accumulation of fat in adult female elk, and that follows roughly just slightly lag behind the plant growth curve. And the birth of the young is timed to basically synchronize to be right behind the peak of female fat accumulation. So as we move into the coming decades, there's been a number of climate models that have been downscaled to give us projections over the Blue Mountains. We're likely to continue to see an increase in average temperature throughout the year. There's a projected increase in precipitation actually, but primarily as rain. And we may see less rain in the summer and fall, so even drier summers, and a decrease in our snowpack, both in the duration and the amount. And we are projected to see an increase in the variability of our extreme events, like floods and droughts. So how these things play, these projected climate changes are going to have some significant impacts to our plant community. Our plant growth is starting earlier in the spring. We've already been observing that. It should be becoming shorter in duration. The timing of when that phenological timing is generally becoming more variable. We've seen less available soil moisture. We expect that to continue. And all of this can lead to possible shifts in our vegetation types or plant communities. And so what do these changes mean, for elk in sort of that more mechanistic way, like is expressed by body fat, and how does the timing of plant growth impact them? Well, here, this is the first panel I've shown already and walked through. And then I've drawn this sort of dotted blue line down the center to kind of line them up together. So if we look at this under the same, the same as the top, but with the future climate projections, we have our, decreased duration of snowpack here, almost half the time these are conceptual, but half the time of the current climate, the much reduced soil moisture, the plant growth curve that's both compressed through the spring season and shifted earlier, and then the female body fat accumulation also the same thing. It's still cued to timed to the plant growth, but it's also compressed. And which the most concerning, I think is the sort of the birth asynchrony hypothesis here, that we'll see the birth of calves not being able to respond as rapidly as our climate changes. So I'm going to return again to the fat. It's all about body fat, right? So we are fortunate to have in our backyard the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range, which for those of you that don't know, it's a 25,000 plus acre research forest. So it's a kind of a landscape level experimental forest that has a large elk-proof fence surrounding it. And over the past almost 3 decades, they've been able to collect an incredible amount of data on elk locations and body condition and habitat and treatments. So there's a wealth of knowledge, and they've been starting to look at sort of, now they have such a long time series of data, how some of the measured climatological data is impacting elk. So what they do is they handle elk every winter. When they come into, they kind of bring them into they don't have a true wintering area on the forest, so they actually handle the elk every winter time. They basically have a small pasture where they're fed, but they squeeze them through a gate, and they can, capture, I think most of them, and actually measure their body condition and whether they're pregnant or not. And so over those past decades, the years that had higher annual temperatures, the body condition or amount of female body fat was lower. And the same was true for winters with reduced winter snowpack. That also had a negative impact on body condition. And so those kind of things sort of suggest that elk will not do as well under warmer climates and less winter snow. So, but that's an experimental forest with a large fence. Elk are highly mobile. As we know, they are responding to environmental cues that may change their home range, what space they're using in a given year versus another year. Back to this graphic again with the winter range and the summer range. And we know from some of that data that the summer range for elk, at least locally here, was almost half the size of a winter range by animal. So we know they're using a lot smaller space, but it's also the high elevation space where they're using basically for its high nutrient content forage. So if you look at, this is sort of a typical cross section of the Blue Mountains elevationally. So I basically took a line up the Umatilla River basin over to sort of the direction of the La Grande Valley. But that summer range, where the highest quality forage are during summertime when the females are having calves, is that sort of above 4,000 feet, the moisture sites that have higher winter snowpack, more soil moisture, and support more food. Those are the highest elevations, and that area of the landscape is limited. So they can't keep moving up and finding higher elevation forage as things get hotter and drier. So we may run into a habitat limitation issue with our summer range. So some kind of things to take away. We found that locally there was a large variability in the dates in which elk migrated, the size of their summer home range over time. Interannual variation was quite high, and these are probably in response to annual climate and plant phenology and then other environmental cues. Preliminary research at Starkey suggested elk productivity was negatively impacted by warming temperatures and decreased annual snowpack. And I think that we really are limited in the amount of summer range in the Blue Mountains. And so how are elk going to respond to that if we see a reduction in summer habitat? We could see reduction in population, or they could change their distribution instead of looking for high elevation summer range, they may favor agricultural areas where there's a lot of high quality forage. But so I've painted a little bit of a bleak picture, but obviously we're not just going to sit back on our haunches and just watch this unfold. So we always talk about mitigation strategies for a lot of different activities that we know are a result of human or anthropogenic sources or human caused issues. So what can we do about it? So first off, we just need to keep doing good work and improve the quality and effectiveness of our existing habitat sort of using a targeted approach. So we have some of those modeling products that we know where to get the biggest bang for our buck, where elk more likely to use, you know, on the landscape, so we can kind of focus in a focused approach. We need to continue to do the research and monitoring on climate change effects on wildlife. We really can't say anything unless we're looking. I think that's pretty obvious, but it's important because, you know, it's hard to fund these kind of things. And then we need to be forward looking and, you know, protect some of those critical habitats that the future climate conditions may be limiting. So in my eyes, the summer range is where we're gonna want to be working in the future. So thank you everybody for listening. I know sometimes my talks are a little heavy, but this research was funded through a Forest Service grant, as I mentioned, and also I want to acknowledge Mike Wisdom from the Forest Service and Colette from our IT department for providing some of the conceptual diagrams there that I showed. And of course, I'll take questions at some point, and I'm just popping my email up so you can feel free to contact me anytime if you want more information.
Thank you, Scott. That was awesome. I know I hear it. Move along.